Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude, and we have with us the distinguished Dr. Sanjay Baru, who is an eminent academic, scholar, writer, best-selling author, former editor of a broadsheet, and also has been media advisor to a former prime minister. And today we are going to use his expertise as an international economist, as a geo-economist, as a strategist, to help us understand that what led the current Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Kishida, to come out and make this strong statement against the growing Chinese muscle flexing in Asia. What led him to do that in Delhi? And what was new about what he said, other than what China and Russia have been irking the Japanese about, and what is new about the Japanese-India arrangement, which is already on a very strong footing. So your views, sir.
Well, Maroof, I've been thinking about this. I went and attended Prime Minister Kishida's lecture in Delhi, and have been wondering since, why did he deliver this lecture? What was the purpose? I get very strong feeling that a lot of international, foreign policy these days around the world is about domestic politics, and political leaders, whether it's Biden in America or Putin in Russia or Prime Minister Modi in India or Prime Minister Kishida in Japan, they are always doing something with an eye at the domestic voter. And it is entirely possible that part of Kishida's enterprise in projecting himself as a chairman of G7 and a global kind of peacemaker and leader is to do with trying to establish his own position within Japanese politics. I mean, don't forget that unlike Prime Minister Abe, he has not yet acquired, Abe Shinzo, he has not yet acquired a certain gravitas as a political leader. And it's, it's quite understandable. But having said that, I mean, in a sense, that's a kind of a cynical view of whatever he's been doing. I think the second, probably the reason is the fact that the G7 have seriously been concerned about the divisions within the G20. And this whole thing of the global South not going with the West on the Russia-Ukraine issue must have really caused serious concern. And as chairman of G7, I think Prime Minister Kishida decided to reach out to Prime Minister Modi. After all, Japan and India had a bilateral offer as an opportunity to deal with Japan. But I'm one of those who has strongly advocated a bilateral relationship that can withstand pressures from all directions.
Okay, so that's very interesting. Because if you really draw the same analogy to West Asia, where there's a lot of diplomatic churn that is taking place following China's reach out and getting the Iranians and Saudi Arabias to finally engage with each other, India continues to extend its relationship with each of the countries there bilaterally without wanting to take a more proactive, comprehensive role in the region, although it enjoys a lot of goodwill. If you really apply that in the G7 and G20 relationship context, Japan is the current president of the G7, the most powerful economic grouping in the world. India is now the rotatory president of the G20, also an increasingly powerful footprint in the world. And as you brought out, India is hoping to lead the South, which is the developing or the underdeveloped world. Japan is got a voice, but I've always believed that militarily, because it's a dwarf, it is not able to enjoy the kind of clout it could because of the financial clout it has. So where is it that Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Kishida can really work together to address some of the global challenges as they keep bringing it out, whether it's in the area of energy or food supplies, or the ongoing Russian conflict in Ukraine? And Mr. Kishida, after India went straight it off to Ukraine, again as messaging to the Russians just when the Chinese Chinese president was in Russia. So where is it that India and Japan can work together without appearing as a threat to the lobbies that exist in the world?
Well, I think clearly there's a space available for India and Japan. Japan being a developed, modern economy with enormous human capital and technology, and India being a large Asian country with a manpower and some kind of influence within our own region, for us to be working together in a range of countries. I mean, first of all, in our own neighborhood, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, in Bangladesh. If you remember, Prime Minister Kishida's speech made a specific reference to the Northeast Bangladesh.
Absolutely.
In Japanese investment. I think that is important. I think Japan working with India in India's neighborhood is an extremely important bilateral initiative that the two countries can take, and which will benefit the region. It will benefit India, it will benefit Japan, and it will benefit our neighbors. The second area where we can work together is Africa. And I think there, the fact is that both Japan and India have lost influence to China over the last 20 years. And to recover that influence in Africa, it's important that we work together. And Japanese have the money. They have a program called Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, PQI. And we have the experience of working in Africa. We have the experience of building infrastructure, etc. in Africa. So, if the Japanese and Indians can work together in South Asia and Africa, I think this in itself would be a substantial agenda. I am not particularly convinced that India on its own has that kind of an influence today, either in its own region or in Africa. And therefore, working with Japan can certainly help us.
Than what it is between India and China?
Well, first of all, I think China is a global trading nation. I mean, it's world's trading superpower. It sells to every country in the world more than any other country, right? So that it sells more to India than anybody else in itself is not news. China sells more to almost every Asian country than does Japan. So, China is now in a completely different league as a trading power. I think what India and Japan have to really seriously look at is the relationship between trade and investment. That it's not simply trade, but it's increased Japanese investment in India. That too, investment with an export market in mind, as with a classic example of Maruti Suzuki, which is a good example of a Japanese company investing in India, but not just for an Indian market, but for the global market, or at least the regional market. That's the way to go. Unfortunately, the Japanese investment has been slow in coming to India. So unless we speed up the inflow of Japanese investment into India, I don't think the trade angle will be improved very much.
Okay, so we'll come back after a break to look at, the Japanese initiatives as you brought out in South Asia in little more detail, what it means for us and what it means for China. And also, we want to look at one or two other areas where Japan is looking to be engaged with India in a number of other global agenda-related issues, such as what India could be doing along with Japan and other geographical spheres outside South Asia. But that after break. Welcome back. We continue to have the very distinguished Dr. Sanjay Baru with us, who is an economist, a geopolitical observer, author, commentator, and has been a policymaker also in the past. And he has very deep understanding of the issues that drive countries like India and Japan outside a military agenda, but in a geostrategic sense. Dr. Baru sir, you talked about earlier about Japan wanting to make investments, and Prime Minister Kishida announced that for India's Northeast, Bangladesh, and hoping to rope Bhutan also into it. It seems very much like a BIMSTEC initiative, where these countries, which India sees as part of BIMSTEC, Japan is taking the lead to pour in money there. But what is going to be worrying to China is that China has made a lot of investment in some of these countries in the past. Bangladesh, Myanmar, certainly cases in point, and China with its deep pockets is trying to buy out Bhutan. So would it see a new theater of conflict between China and Japan, with Indian territory also becoming involved?
Well, I wouldn't call it a theater of conflict. It will certainly be a theater of competition. And I think that competition is good for the region. If more and more countries compete with each other to invest in our neighborhood, to invest in Bangladesh, to invest in Myanmar, to invest in India, to invest in Nepal, to invest in Bhutan, I mean, why should we object? Because all they're investing here. And when investment comes in, employment opportunities get created, incomes get created, and the local economies benefit. So it's a theater for healthy competition, and I would not object to that. But certainly Japan has deep pockets, and Japan has a long-standing influence in the region. So Japan is not new to the region. And therefore, I think India and Japan working together in this region, particularly BIMSTEC, as you called it correctly, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand region, would I think have a lot of benefits for both Japan and India.
Okay. Japan has also indicated its willingness to mobilize $75 billion in public and private funds in the Indo-Pacific region by 2030. And this will obviously be a hurdle to China's debt trap diplomacy agenda, which has drawn in countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka and made them go bankrupt. But do you think Japan is going in for an overstretch economically by taking on the burden of reviving a whole lot of mismanaged economies, not just in the Indian neighborhood, but even if you stretch the point as far as away as Africa? Rivalry has its limits. Where do you see it going and where do you see it ending?
You're absolutely right. I think this is certainly something that policymakers in New Delhi and in Tokyo would keep in mind. That where you invest is very, very important to take a sensible economic decision, business decision, rather than a purely political or geopolitical decision. And I think that kind of rethink overseas development in our own immediate neighborhood and in Africa, but what we are able to give is peanuts compared to what the Japanese or even the Chinese are able to bring. But I do think that the policymakers in Tokyo and Delhi would be mindful of what you say, the problem of overstretch, and would not make the mistake that China made in its enthusiasm over the past 10 years to push the Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay. Now, Mr. Kishida went from India to Ukraine and clearly took a lot of people by surprise. And the message he gave out was, A, that Japan is going to fund the Ukrainian desire to bounce back with something like $5.5 billion to start with. And as you said, Japan has deep pockets, so I'm sure more will follow to ensure that their initiatives also get the visibility, just like initiatives of America right now to fund the war effort are getting, and not the rebuilding of Ukraine. Japan, as we all know, has a bit of aversion to the military dimensions of any conflict beyond a point. But what he did mention, that Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow, clearly indicating this could be the stepping ground for China, Russia combined to look at China achieving its ambitions in Taiwan, just like China is supportive of whatever Russia has done as yet in Ukraine, supporting in an indirect way that has not made any negative statements about Russia. So where do you see that going? And where do you see Japan being able to confront any aggressive designs of the Chinese, because Japan has started remilitarizing in a way and dispensing with, I think it is Article 6 of their constitution, which talks about a non-aggressive approach to diplomacy. Your views?
Well, I would not exaggerate this whole issue of Taiwan. I don't think the Chinese are going to do in Taiwan what Putin and Russia have done in Ukraine. I think the Western kind of propaganda on this is highly exaggerated. I think the Chinese are long-distance players. They will take their own time to be able to establish an equation with Taiwan that benefits them. And therefore, this fear that tomorrow there could be conflict in the Pacific, very similar to what is happening in Europe, is a highly exaggerated fear in my judgment. As far as Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Ukraine is concerned, well, I think partly it is as G7 chairman. I think he is the only G7 leader who hadn't visited Ukraine and therefore had to be there. I would not exaggerate the prospects for Japan to be in Europe in any big way. Don't forget, Maroof, that the Europeans in the past have not been particularly welcoming to Japan. Even the Americans, we forget the fact that in the 1980s, the Americans had all this voluntary export restraint, the Super 301, Special 301. The single market of Europe was created as a response to the threat from Japan. So the rising Japan in the 80s was seen as a threat. Japan subsequently stagnated through the 90s, the lost decade, and thanks to the leadership of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, Japan has come back onto the global stage. But I think there are limits to what Japan can do on its own. It has to work with other countries.
Reciprocal friends, such as in Southeast Asia, Japan has been repeatedly emphasizing, even Prime Minister Kishida did, about the role of Indo-Pacific. And as Japan was the first that kind of pioneered the idea of Asia-Pacific and trying to merge them through the high seas, where China is now in every place seen as the threatening dragon. And Japan has invested a lot in making the Southeast Asian tigers what they are today. I think deep inside, nobody in Southeast Asia misses that point, whatever China's deep pockets be today. Well, thank you very much for your insights. And it's very clear that Japan and India are possibly the saving grace for Asia as the clock continues to tick, with China wanting to expand its footprint here, there, and everywhere. And we'll need to wait and watch how things pan out. But until then, thanks for your wisdom and thanks to all of you for watching. Until our next episode, goodbye.